All right, let's dive right into this explainer. We're looking at a fascinating 13th century manuscript that has completely shaped how we understand early Islamic India. I mean, this text, some treat it as absolute gospel, while others brush it off as pure fiction. We're talking, of course, about the Chachnama. On the surface, it looks like a pretty straightforward Persian account of the 8th century Arab conquests of Sindh. But underneath all that, it's hiding a massive chronological secret. It's basically a historical true crime mystery that challenges everything we think we know about how history is actually recorded. To solve this mystery, we're going to follow a quick roadmap. First, the book and the gap. Then, Sindh before the Arabs. Next up, the conquest and early governance. After that, we'll look at fact, fiction, and translation, and we'll wrap up with its contested modern legacy.
Starting with Section 1, the book and the gap. Let's look at our primary piece of evidence, compiled by a 13th century scholar named Ali Kufi.
So we usually call it the Chachnama, right? Literally, the Book of Chach, because it focuses so heavily on an early Brahmin ruler. But it has an alternate name, the Fatalama-i Sindh, or Book of the Conquest of Sindh, and that title really gives away its true purpose. See, Ali Kufi compiled this text for a regional ruler named Nasiruddin Kabacha. At the time, the massive Ghorid Empire, which was this major power stretching across Central Asia and northern India, was completely fragmenting. Local rulers were absolutely desperate for legitimacy. So what better political tool than a conquest narrative tying a newly independent leader to the glorious original Islamic conquests of the past?
And here is the major plot twist of our historical detective story. The actual events involving Chach, Raja Dahir, and the young Arab commander Muhammad bin Qasim, those happened roughly between 622 and 715 CE. But Ali Kufi didn't compile this surviving Persian text until 1216. That is a jaw-dropping 500-year gap. Think about it. That would be like someone today writing a definitive, moment-by-moment history of the 1500s based entirely on some newly discovered scrolls. That massive gap is exactly why modern historians have so many questions about its reliability.
Moving on to Section 2, Sindh before the Arabs. To get what Ali Kufi was writing about, we really have to understand the world he was describing before the Umayyad armies ever showed up.
Before the conquest, Sindh was this incredibly cosmopolitan, multi-religious trading hub. It was economically linked to India, Persia, Arabia, Sri Lanka, the whole shebang, and it was ruled by the Raja Dynasty. The crucial point here is how the book dramatizes the end of that dynasty and the rise of Chach. The text says Chach was a brilliant Brahmin administrator who entered royal service. But then, the narrative takes a highly theatrical turn. Queen Suhandi falls deeply in love with him. The king dies. Chach uses his political cunning, marries the queen, and just seizes power. I mean, it reads way less like dry history and more like a 13th century soap opera or a classic Persian royal romance. This definitely leaves scholars wondering, okay, how much of this is historical fact and how much is just dramatic flair?
But regardless of those romantic embellishments, the text portrays Chach as a seriously formidable, expansionist ruler. He organized a highly effective regional administration, strategically pushed his territory into Makran and parts of Punjab, and heavily emphasized diplomacy. He also built these deep intelligence networks, all while establishing his grand capital at the ancient city of Aror. Basically, this centralized, powerful state he built totally set the stage for his successor, Raja Dahir, who was about to face an unprecedented threat from the West.
Which brings us to Section 3, Conquest and Early Governance. Let's look at this clash of empires and see how it builds up to the famous 8th century Arab invasion.
The text actually gives us a really specific, inciting incident for the Arab invasion in 711 CE. According to the Chachnama, pirates off the coast of Sindh attacked Arab ships carrying gifts, Muslim women, and pilgrims. When the regional governor demanded compensation from Raja Dahir, things escalated fast, leading to the dispatch of a 17-year-old commander named Muhammad bin Qasim. Now, modern historians point out that while that pirate attack likely did happen, the real drivers were way more geopolitical. The rapidly expanding Umayyad Caliphate, which was a massive Islamic empire, wanted to control Indian Ocean trade routes and secure a strategic frontier. It was about empire building, plain and simple.
So following the decisive battles and the defeat of Raja Dahir, Muhammad bin Qasim actually had to govern this massive newly acquired territory. And what makes the Chachnama so historically valuable isn't just the battle scenes, it's its depiction of highly pragmatic early Muslim governance.
Rather than coming in and wiping the slate clean, the Arab conquerors actually kept the existing bureaucratic systems. They integrated local administrators, negotiated incredibly practical settlements with Brahmins and Buddhists, and kept the traditional land revenue structures completely intact. It really highlights a reality of integration and diplomacy that totally defies our modern stereotype of a purely destructive religious war.
Now we hit Section 4, Fact, Fiction, and Translation. This is arguably the biggest debate among scholars today.
You see, Ali Kufi, our 13th century compiler, explicitly claimed he found an old, lost Arabic manuscript in Sindh and simply translated it into Persian. But did he really? Historians generally agree that the geography, the place names, and the core administrative structures reflect very reliable local traditions, but there are some highly questionable elements here too. The exact eloquent speeches? The romantic subplots, like with Queen Suhandi? The detailed personal motivations? Those heavily mirror 13th century Persian mirror for princes literature. If you're not familiar, those were essentially political advice manuals meant to teach kings how to rule. So it's highly likely Ali Kufi took fragments of truth, Arabic reports, and local memory and just wove them all together with Persian political storytelling.
And that brings us to a really vital perspective from modern experts, particularly scholar Mayan Ahmed Asif. He summarizes the modern consensus beautifully. He says the Chachnama is not a pristine archive of the 8th century. Instead, it's a literary, political, ideological, historical reconstruction. It was specifically designed to speak to the political needs of a 13th century Indo-Persian court, providing them with lessons on statecraft, etiquette, and legitimacy.
Let's wrap up with Section 5, a contested modern legacy. We need to look at how this ancient, blended manuscript became a highly weaponized symbol in the modern era.
So, how did this modern misinterpretation even start? Well, it really kicked off during the British colonial era. British historians desperately needed a history of early Sindh, and because they were basically lacking alternative sources, they treated the Chachnama's dramatized narratives as absolute literal fact. When Mirza Khalid Beg Frudenbeg published the standard English translation back in 1900, this literal interpretation was completely cemented. Colonial writers essentially ignored the text's literary complexities and its Persianate embellishments. They turned a deeply nuanced political drama into a flat, factual textbook.
Fast forward to today, and we can clearly see how modern nation-building has pulled the text in completely opposite directions. In Pakistani nationalist historiography, the events of the Chachnama are often framed around Muhammad bin Qasim, portraying him as the first South Asian Muslim hero and the very founder of Islamic identity in the region. Conversely, in Indian and alternative historiographies, the lens is flipped onto Raja Dahir, who is portrayed as a heroic resistance figure defending his homeland from foreign invaders. Both sides have taken these very complex, pragmatic historical figures and turned them into highly polarized symbols to serve modern identities.
What you should really take away from this explainer is that by flattening this narrative into modern political talking points, we lose the text's most vital historical lessons. The source material shows us that this wasn't just some purely religious conflict. It was driven by power, elite alliances, and frontier politics. We forget the prominent roles that women actually played in these courts. We forget that Sindh was a deeply cosmopolitan society where Buddhists and Hindus coexisted and where Arab conquerors negotiated rather than annihilated. We absolutely have to view this text through its heavily Persianized historical lens if we want to appreciate its true richness.
Ultimately, the Chachnama is fascinating precisely because it forces us to confront the very nature of history itself. It leaves us with a profound question. When we read history, are we learning what actually happened, or just how later societies wanted to remember it? The next time you hear a historical narrative presented as simple, straightforward fact, remember the 500-year gap of the Chachnama. Stop and ask yourself, who is doing the telling and why? Thanks for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this sparked your curiosity to look a little deeper into the history you consume.